from anointing a king-in-waiting, many of his colleagues hadn't even heard of him.
We all know it was an important interview now with hindsight. At the time, I don't think many people in the BBC knew what an Ayatollah was. I remember people in the BBC club would say, "What's an Ayatollah, and who's this man? How do you pronounce Khomeni? Is it Khomeni or Khomeini?" There was quite a level of ignorance. We weren't then assuming that he would be in power. What we were looking for was the possibility of a democratic Iran.
He's established himself in a small village 20 miles from Paris, in a modest little house. There, surrounded
We'd
by
gathered in the
activist
courtyard
followers.
outside with his entourage and all these students, and seemed very friendly and very welcoming and very pleased that the BBC was taking an interest. And then they showed us into this room, and we sat cross-legged on the floor. Then he came in and sat down, squatted, about 2 feet away. Didn't look at us at all. A face of granite, no emotion whatsoever. No eye contact at all. Just this voice. Areas of questioning were agreed in advance with the Ayatollah's people. The first question was about Islam, and I then assumed that there was no place for the religious minorities, and so I asked a question about the minorities. The Ayatollah then answered it, and then turned to his people, and they all said to me, "That must stop. If you ask another question which is not on the script, we will stop this interview." And I said, "But there is no script." They said, "Yes, there is. It's been agreed. It's a script." And so I continued with it and took it back. It was up to people who knew much more about the situation in Iran and BBC policy. It was up to them to decide whether the interview should be broadcast.
When you came back with your interview, it seemed to go down well, didn't it? Certainly from the paperwork I have here, Mark Dodd, head of the Eastern Service, said the questions were intended not to give the Ayatollah an opportunity for propaganda, but to reveal the reality of his political views. Given the restrictions on that interview, could it ever do that? Did it do that?
Well, Mark is quite correct, and this was the intention. This was our intention.
But not the result.
The result was different. The Ayatollah did use it as a platform for his own views. That's quite true. And that was surprising, and that was not our intention to give him such a platform. To that extent, it wasn't a good interview. I wasn't able to press him with supplementary questions. We had to take what he gave us. On the other hand, it was a good interview in the sense that it did show what we were facing.
David Perman admits the BBC had been in the dark about what the Ayatollah represented. But Dr. Abbas Malani insists that if the BBC was unaware of the true power and policies of Khomeini, ignorance was no excuse.
Khomeini had basically in his books said everything he was going to do. But he decided that when he is going to be in Paris, he made a very conscious decision to look and talk as if he is a Gandhi-like liberal, which was no clergy is going to have any role. There will be freedom. There won't be any coercion. Women won't be forced to wear a hijab.
So the BBC should have read his books.
Well, I would think that a good journalist in those days would have obviously read these books, but it wasn't only the BBC that hadn't done this homework. Almost none of them asked questions based on Khomeini's writings.
The BBC mattered more, though, because, unlike most other foreign news organisations, it was broadcasting into Iran. But given that Khomeini did his best to conceal his real plans, is it really fair to blame the BBC for failing to draw attention to the perils he posed? Or, to put it another way, that the corporation was the victim of manipulation rather than the perpetrator of it? Professor Ali Ansari is having none of it.
It would have been odd for the BBC not to have interviewed Ayatollah Khomeini. It would have been odd if they were a news-gathering agency. But at the same time, I think we have to bear in mind that clearly there are certain responsibilities need to be borne in mind when you're running a news organisation. I mean, I think they didn't take it seriously, what Khomeini represented. But, if you ask me, was that irresponsible? Yes, it was. I think people need to accept that they made mistakes about this and they interpreted things wrongly and they didn't want to see things. They just did not want to see things.
Mark Dodd says he wasn't involved in setting the editorial parameters of the interview. That was done by others within the World Service. But as the head of the Eastern Service, how did he feel about the fact supplementary questions weren't allowed?
I think it's an unsatisfactory basis on which to conduct an interview, and I always have thought so. You could argue that the man himself was the story. What you could get out of him was going to illuminate the character of the man. I think you can make a case for an interview of that kind, but I think it's flawed. Of course, our coverage was not as full as we would have wished, and there were undoubtedly gaps. So I'm not for a moment saying that this was an impeccable service. There were occasions when we made mistakes. I am still sorry that we made those mistakes. They were infinitely less than our critics suggested.
I've now managed to track down the former BBC correspondent who was the target of that withering attack from the British ambassador Anthony Parsons. Andrew Whitley was the BBC's man in Tehran as revolutionary fervour swept the city.
And they're taking over the streets.
Whitley still vividly remembers the reaction to the BBC interview with Khomeini in November 1978.
Almost everyone in the country was talking about it, talking about what he had to say, the fact that he was being given this airtime. People would stop each other in the streets, in the bazaars. People would say, "Did you hear? He's finally been allowed to talk." It had a huge impact.
Whitley may have seen himself as a neutral observer, but street-fighting opponents of the Shah clearly saw him as the man to ring.
I can recall going into a bazaar in the streets of one of the southern Iranian cities and seeing scrawled up in graffiti on the wall, "If you have any news, call this number," and it's my home phone telephone number.
The army seem to have come out now in force.
So, given his trusted status with opponents of the Shah and his relative inexperience as a foreign correspondent, does Whitley accept that he may indeed have been biased, as suggested by the British ambassador?
I think that Tony Parsons was unfair in saying that I'd fallen under the influence of a particularly negative group of journalists. In fact, the reverse was the case, was that the foreign journalists who were visiting the country would come to talk to me about what was going on, because I was one of the few who actually spoke some Farsi and knew the country reasonably well. Tony Parsons himself, in retrospect, admitted that he was wrong and I was right.
But these were heady days, weren't they? If you have your hand on your heart, would you say now, looking back, that you did in fact have a lot of sympathy yourself with those opposed to the Shah?
Yes, I would say that they had justice on their side. I personally believed that change was overdue in Iran, but I certainly would not say that I was advocating either for a leftist revolution or for the overthrow of the Shah.
But does he accept the allegation that the corporation did, at the very least, fan the flames of the revolution?
I wouldn't use those words to say the fan the flames of the revolution, but the BBC did play a role. And it was something that was uncomfortable for BBC management to admit openly. They didn't at the time. But yes, I would agree that the BBC made a difference. If it wasn't for the BBC's broadcasts into the countries and its huge listenership, I think that the revolution might not have proceeded as quickly as it did.
Do you think that's a role that the BBC should be playing?
No, I don't think that the BBC should go that far. I think that the BBC ought to be careful about overstepping the line between reporting and being seen as
part and parcel of the opposition movement. I don't believe that the BBC ought to, as a foreign broadcasting organisation, ought to be in a position of attempting to change domestic events. But I wouldn't put intent on our side.
" 30 years later, BBC broadcasts are still being heard in Iran. And, just as before, its new Persian TV service has been accused of bias by the government in Tehran. But Behruz Afag, who's in charge of the service, says such allegations are completely unfounded.
Programs are reviewed constantly, regularly, are translated back, other people, other colleagues, everybody is watching, listening. These are the ways in which you make sure that the programs are objective, are impartial, are accurate, do reflect all the various kind of views. Quality and standards of journalism and interviewing has improved over these years, and also the prevalence of so many different media outlets means that very few media organizations have got that really powerful position of reporting something on their own. And I would say, I think it's become even more entrenched as modern values. Try and detach yourself from your own personal views and you report it as it is.
Despite the numerous allegations, I found no evidence of any actual bias in the BBC's reporting of the revolution and events leading up to it. But some do seem to believe that the BBC could have been both more rigorous and dispassionate in its coverage of events. And Andrew Whitley evidently feels that he and other colleagues in the BBC did allow themselves to be swept up by the fervent clamour for change. Yet when that change came, it took a form they never predicted.
Certainly the way that the revolution turned out was a disaster for many people in Iran, and I have personal regrets over that, having been a minor actor in that particular drama. Friends of mine died. Iranians were tortured who I knew. I have vivid memories of going into the morgues in Tehran after the nightly executions from the revolutionary court set up after Khomeini had taken power. Those haunt one for a long time.